Don't forget that you're listening to Nightmare. I want to share with you a story I lived through until a few months ago, and one I prefer not to remember. Recently, when talking to an old friend, I decided to tell it here to let it out, as I still find it very hard to live with. Perhaps those who have had traumatic experiences will understand. The story began in late 2015, when I moved out of my parents' house to be closer to my first job, to a place in the heart of the financial district. It was the first time I was leaving my family, but the opportunity was good since the apartment had 3 rooms at a great price. The building was old but cozy, according to the young man who made the contract with me. There were many older people living there, so I rarely ran into anyone in the hallways, which didn't bother me. I'm not very social, and the low rent made up for the issues with the place. The lights in the hallways didn't work, giving it a gloomy and neglected feel, but I didn't mind. The elevator also broke down a couple of times a week, but I thought it was a good way to get some exercise. The musty smell and the scent of old things were unpleasant, but I would quickly go up to the apartment to rest and forget about it. A few weeks after moving in, I started getting requests to show the apartment to potential tenants, since there were vacant rooms. One night, a young woman, a student, and waitress from a nearby bar asked to see it after 11 p.m. Although it was late, I agreed since that was the only time she could come. I was already fast asleep at that hour, but I got up, splashed some water on my face to wake up, and despite my exhaustion, I went to open the door. We laughed about how opposite our schedules were, and she tried to reassure me, telling me not to worry. When we got into the elevator, it stopped after 2 floors. I explained to Sarah that this happened frequently, so I pressed the button to make it work again. When it did, we went down and began to ascend the remaining 6 floors. At that hour, the appearance of the building, with its dark hallways and closed doors, seemed even stranger. Sarah tried to remain calm, but she asked me not to worry. As we ascended, we heard the sound of the elevator moving, and suddenly, an old song began to play near the 6th floor door. Although it should have been something nostalgic, at that moment it made me feel very uncomfortable. I didn't tell Sarah that. Since I had pressed the ground floor button, there was no reason for the elevator to be on that floor. It gave me a strange sensation that we weren't alone. When we entered the apartment, Sarah changed her expression upon seeing the space, with a large window and a room that was perfect for her. She liked the price and the features so much that she asked me to reserve the room right then. As I explained the expenses and other details, she asked why the hallways were so neglected and dark. I replied laughing that I thought the elderly people living there didn't go out after 8 p.m., and that I was the same as them. I left her at the building's door and waited for her to take a taxi. She told me she would move in exactly 1 week. When I returned to the building, the elevator doors were starting to close, and as soon as it saw me enter, it began to rise, as if someone had operated it. I began to think of various explanations, maybe a senile old man trying to make a joke, or a grandchild stuck in the building with nothing to do. However, the strange coincidences began to torment me and keep me on edge. I saw how the elevator stopped on the 8th floor and didn't move again. I pressed the button over and over, but nothing happened, as if someone were stuck on that floor. I knew it was time to take the stairs. As I did, I heard a noise from the floor above. At first I thought it was music, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman's voice, as if someone were talking to herself. My instinct told me I should make noise, that my loud footsteps would make whatever was up there move away before I saw it. I kept climbing, and before reaching the 8th floor, I saw that my floor's hallway was only lit by the elevator's light. When I looked toward the stairs, I saw some very long, bony legs, rapidly climbing toward the 9th floor. I froze. I didn't know whether to go up and find out who or what it was, or simply go into the apartment and forget everything. I closed the door, gathered my courage, and decided to go up. When I reached the 9th floor, I found the entrance to another apartment, which was completely open. I knew it was vacant because it was the apartment directly above mine. Looking inside, I saw a horrible figure moving in the darkness, only concealed by the light coming through the window without curtains. I ran downstairs, and behind me, I closed the door with the 5 security locks that until that moment I had thought were an exaggeration. The next day, I informed the building manager, who went to check the apartment above but found nothing unusual. The routine continued, although something still disturbed my peace of mind. A guy named Raymer took the third room in the apartment. He paid 3 months in advance, left some things behind, and mentioned he would return in a few weeks due to a work trip. After his move-in, our interactions were sparse due to our differing schedules. The days went by quietly until one rainy night, where the lightning made it hard for me to rest. It was 2 a.m. when, amidst the storm's noise, I clearly heard the apartment door open, followed by footsteps approaching the hallway. Then the door to one of the rooms opened, and the footsteps quickly reached my door. At first I thought I was dreaming, but suddenly someone violently knocked on my door. Surprised, I grabbed a cup from my nightstand as my only weapon and opened the door cautiously. It was Sarah, soaked and trembling, but not just from the cold. She told me that she had come back late from work, took the elevator, and, as on the worst nights, it stopped on the second floor. When she got out, she heard footsteps following her, which made her feel she wasn't alone. She ran up the stairs to her apartment. In her room, she hesitated between sleeping or telling me what happened. I told her she had made the right decision. I decided to go down to see if I could find something. I asked her to stay by the door and scream if anything happened. Although we were both very scared, I tried to calm her down. I grabbed a hammer from the storage room and the largest knife from the kitchen, opened the apartment door, and we went out. In the distance, in the light of the elevator, we saw the figure of a huge woman, naked, bald, without eyebrows, and horribly thin, staring at us. I don't clearly remember if I screamed, but the terror was so overwhelming that it felt like thousands of thorns were piercing my chest and back. Sarah quickly pulled me back into the apartment, locking the 5 locks behind us. We were frozen, speechless, until we heard the elevator move away from our floor. It was one of those experiences that take time to process. We couldn't understand what was happening or how such a quiet and dimly lit building during the day could transform into a real haunted house by night. We talked about what happened until we fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, Raymer, who had been absent for days, arrived at the apartment and was surprised to find us there. The fear lingered, but at least we were together to face what we didn't understand. We explained what had happened to Raymer, though deep down, I felt like he wasn't going to believe us. Despite his young age, he contributed to online publications and was about to publish a book with a small publishing house. When we finished telling him, he surprised us by saying, "So, what are we going to do?" Not only did he believe us, but he also admitted to having seen something similar in the bushes at the entrance of the building the first time he arrived. Additionally, he had also experienced the elevator malfunctions and the footsteps following him up the stairs. We shared the disbelief that we weren't alone in this experience. I sent a message to the building manager, asking to speak with him as soon as possible and explaining why. That day, Sarah and Raymer went out to run errands, and I stayed home working. While I was doing so, an overwhelming discomfort took over me. I didn't want to go out, but when I realized the afternoon had passed and it was starting to get dark again, I felt nervous, and that's when the doorbell rang. When I looked out, I saw it was a neighbor, a man around 80 years old with dyed black hair and a very thin mustache. I opened the door, and he apologized repeatedly. The man explained that he wanted to apologize for something, but what caught my attention was that, amid his apologies, he mentioned the lines several times, which left me uneasy. Finally, I asked him if he was referring to something specific, and he replied, still with a trembling voice, that he didn't want to cause any trouble, and that it wouldn't happen again. Something didn't add up, but I couldn't fully understand it. The man said goodbye and took the elevator. I watched him and noticed that he got off on the 6th floor. That night, the building seemed to be filled with a silent cry, a strange feeling that chilled me. The next day, I told everything to the building manager, who, laughing, told me that Mr. Nicholas lived alone and never had visitors. By his attitude, it seemed like he thought it was a joke or a fantasy, and he told me maybe the old man was just messing with us. "Maybe he's the one who took you to the stairs," he said between laughs. However, even though I tried to share the story with Sarah and Raymer, something inside me kept questioning whether what we were experiencing was really so easily explained. As the days went by, everything calmed down. In fact, we never brought it up again, but the discomfort remained. Months later, in the fall of 2016, they gathered at Fernanda's apartment, a friend of Sarah's. I remember Raymer mentioning something before leaving, and that was that since that apology to Don Nicholas, It wasn't as unusual to run into some of the tenants at night. In fact, I barely noticed it, but I did remember encountering some elderly people walking their dogs at night, something unthinkable before. Soon after, on a Saturday morning, I was returning to the city after a work trip, and upon arriving at the building, I found an ambulance. At first, I got used to these situations, but what gave me the chills was that, according to the neighbors, Don Nicholas had passed away. Despite the months that had passed, I had managed to stop thinking about those horrible weeks. When I arrived at the building, I didn't know how poor Sarah did it, still arriving very late, while I locked myself in my room and considered the day over by 8 p.m. Although things seemed to have calmed down, there were no incidents like before, it was still pretty terrifying to enter the place alone. The elevator still malfunctioned from time to time. 2 days after Don Nicholas's death, I couldn't sleep due to the sound of someone walking in the apartment above. Fernanda, the new tenant, not knowing much about what had happened, tried to speak to the neighbors at 3 a.m. Desperate from not being able to sleep, Fernanda went up to try and talk to the neighbors, but found the door to the vacant apartment open. She returned and never mentioned the possibility of going up again. Fernanda began to get to know the building and realized that the elevator stopped whenever it wanted. Footsteps could be heard going from one floor to another late at night, but I wasn't even sure about my strategy of going to bed early anymore. Even at 6 in the evening, the building turned into a cemetery. The silence reigned, and the place seemed darker every day. One day in the early morning, Fernanda arrived at the building after her boyfriend had dropped her off. He waited at the entrance to make sure she got in safely, but since there was no light in the building, a figure of a naked woman appeared in the darkness. When Fernanda alerted her boyfriend, he tried to talk to the woman and ask if she needed help. The figure turned halfway and walked back into the darkness. Shocked by what they had just seen, they left, and Fernanda moved out the following weekend. A week later, Sarah also decided to leave. Although I tried to hold on, it soon became impossible to live there, and despite the visits I received to view the apartment, no one was convinced to live in the other rooms. After 2 months, I moved back in with my parents to save up and look for another apartment. The building manager asked me to give him the keys at night, the only time he could receive them. He said, "I'll wait for you in your apartment." When I arrived, everything was completely dark. I went up the stairs, and when I entered, he asked me to check if everything was in order together. That's when we heard a woman's voice talking to herself in the hallway. It was a horrible voice. The manager asked me to leave the apartment door open, but his tone was strange, as if he wasn't afraid. We laughed, though I didn't understand what he meant. We checked room by room, but I could only focus on the voice, which was getting closer and closer. At one point, when we were in my bedroom, I'm sure the voice was coming from inside the apartment. "Just go, everything is fine, I'll stay here for a while to lock up," the manager told me, forcing me to go downstairs. When I left, I realized that the light seemed to have completely gone out. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and began to go down. On the 7th floor, a woman opened her door, lighting up the hallway. "God bless you, young man," she said, and left the door open so I could go down. Grateful, I continued on my way, but when the woman closed the door, footsteps approached from the darkness. I prayed it was the manager, but it wasn't. I ran as fast as I could, and when the footsteps were very close, a new light appeared. An elderly woman opened the door on the 5th floor and told me, "Be careful going down, son." She was accompanied by her husband. On the 3rd floor, the light started working halfway, and I was able to run downstairs. When I finally exited into the alley, I looked back at the building, completely confused. I didn't understand what was happening or how long it would continue. I decided to leave, leaving a box with some things behind. But I never returned for them, not even for all the money in the world. I would never go back to that building. Something lived in the darkness, and no matter what it was, I didn't want to know. I knew that for some tenants, that place was their entire legacy, but I didn't want to be part of that story. I wasn't going to risk staying there for even one more minute. No matter the price or location, that building was no longer for me.